नारायणस्य महाजलोह मध्ये परिभ्रमाजमानानामेककोटिब्रह्माण्डानाम् एकदमे व्यक्ताव्यक्तमहदहङ्गारपृथिव्यप्तेजो वायुवाकाशादि आवरणैरावृते महरिब्रह्माण्डखण्डमण्डले आधारशक्तिकूर्मानन्दात्यष्टमूर्तिधारितोपरि परिप्रतिष्ठितस्य अतल वितल सुतल कलाकल महातल पातालाख्य सप्तलोकानामूर्ध्वभागे उपरलोक दुपर्लोक महर्लोक जनो लोक तपो लोक सत्यलोकादि षल्लोकानामधो भागे फणिराजशेषस्य सहस्रफणामणिमण्डलमण्डिते विन्दन्ति शुद्धादण्डोत्तम्भिते लोकाचलवलयुते लवणेक्षुसुरादर्पर्दधिक्षीरस्वादूधकार्णव परिवृतजम्बोप्लक्षकुचक्रौञ्जजागजाल्मले पुष्कराख्य सप्तद्वीपदीपिते इन्द्रकशेरुताम्रगभस्ति गन्धर्वनागसौम्यवारण भारत नवखण्डात्मके दण्डकारण्य जम्बकारण्य बदरिकारण्य देविकारण्य कामिकारण्य कदलिकारण्य नैमिषारण्य नहुषारण्य जम्बुकारण्य सख्यारण्ये तु दशारण्यैर्विराजिते अयोध्या मथुरा माया काशी काञ्ची अवन्तिका द्वारकापुरी इत्यादि महापुण्यनगरीभिरुपशोभिते तत्तत्कुलाचलेभ्यः प्रचलितकालिन्दी नर्मदा गोदावरी गण्डकी कृष्णवेणी तुङ्गभद्रा पिनाकिनी यमुना प्रभृति अनेक पुण्य नदीभिः सहस्र प्रसरे गुरुवाञ्चालमखलेशाङ्गवङ्ग कलिङ्ग काम्भोज मगध मन्त्रमालव नेपाल चौल गौण मलयाळ महलद्रविड द्राविड कर्णाटक विराट वराट पाण्ड्य पुलिन्द पदाशार्णव सूरसेन भोजपाक्लय बर्बर केकय कोसल कुन्तल वीर सौराष्ट्र महाराष्ट्रादि षट्पञ्चाशद्देश विराजिते सत्कोटियोजन विस्तीर्णे भूमण्डले कुबेरुनिशत हेमकूट हिमवद्विन्ध्याचलाना हरिवर्ष किम्पुरुषवर्षयोर्दक्षिणे मलयाजलादुत्तरे वर्णप्रस्थप्रांशुसूर्यावर्तनरमणकमहारकपाञ्चजन्य सिंहलङ्काकेय नवखण्डमण्डिते कर्मभूमौ सौम्यवती पुण्यक्षेत्रे श्रीरङ्गवृषगिरि सत्यव्रत यदुगिरि पाण्डुरङ्ग अहोबिल प्रभृति भगवद्दिव्यदेशानाम् आम्रपर्णी कावेरी पयस्विनी कृतमाला बाहुदा सुवर्णमुखी पिनाकिनी कृष्णा नदी गोदावरी च उत्तरप्रदेश उत्तरतटे काश्यादि निखिल पुण्यक्षेत्रादिक हिमवन्मेरोर्दक्षिणदिग्भागे अस्मिन् यागमण्डपे कल्याणमण्डपे भूमण्डलस्योपरि स्थिता भुवस्सुवर्महत्यनस्तपस्तच्च लोकानामुपरि ब्रह्माण्डकटाहस्योपरि भागे आवरणज बहिर्महान्धकारस्योपरि स्थिते अनेककोटिवह्निर्केन्दु दिव्यविमाने श्रीमद्वैकुण्ठाख्ये दिव्यरत्नमयानन्दमण्डपे भगवदाधारशक्तिप्रकृतिकूर्मानन्द धर्मात्यष्टमूर्तिधारितोपरि सहस्रदल परिमित महापद्मस्य पूर्वादेशानान्ददले शिवमलाद्यष्टदिः परिवृतः तत्कर्णिकोपरि सात्विकादित्रयान्विते तदुपरि अग्निमण्डलादिमण्डलत्रये तदुपरि रुक्यजुस्सामाधर्वाङ्गिरसान्विते अनेककोटिसूर्यप्रकाश दिव्यसिंहासनस्योपरि प्रतिष्ठितस्य अपरिमित तेजोराशिभिः अखिल जगन्मातृश्रीभूनीलाभिः परिसेव्यमानस्य प्राच्यादीशानपर्यन्तम् वासुदेवादिमूर्तिभिः तेषां शक्तिभिः परिसेव्यमानस्य तद्बहिः आदिवराहाद्यस्तविद्येश्वरैः परिसेव्यमानस्य तद्बहिः सुदर्शनादिदिव्यायुधधारिभिः परिसेव्यमानस्य तद्बहिः अनन्तगरुड विश्वक्सेनादिनित्यैः परिसेव्यमानस्य तद्बहिः द्वाराध्यक्षैः
चण्डादिद्वारबालकैः परिसेव्यमानस्य
तद्बहिः कुमुदाद्यष्टपार्षदेश्वरैः परिसेव्यमानस्य
तद्बहिः इन्द्राद्यष्टलोकबालकैः परिसेव्यमानस्य
तद्बहिः परितः पञ्चकालपरायणैर्भगवच्छेषकर्मनिष्ठैः सालोक्यादिपदस्थितैः नित्यतृप्तैः परिसेव्यमानस्य
अखिलजगत्सृष्टिस्थितिसंहारकारणकर्तृभूतस्य
भगवतो वासुदेवस्य
शङ्खचक्रगदाशार्ङ्गकृपाणपञ्चायुधधरस्य
दिव्यरत्नखचितकेयोरहारनूपुरकौस्तुभमणिमण्डलमण्डित श्रीदेवदेवस्य
श्रीमन्नारायणदयावतीर्णकासारभूतमहदात्मज भक्तिसारचटकोपकुलशेखर विष्णुचित्तभक्ताङ्घ्रिरेणु परकालादिदिव्यसूरिभिः
भार्यमङ्गलाक्षरामविश्रयामुनगोष्ठीपूर्णारङ्गकाञ्चीपूर्णादि ज्ञानसूरिभिः
रामानुजादिस्वाचार्यवर्यैः
वसिष्ठभृगुकुलस्य पुनः क्रतुमरीक्षाङ्गीरसत्रिसन्निजैः महर्षिभिः
नवब्रह्मादिभिः स्तूयमानस्य
सनन्दन सनत्कुमार सनत्सुजातपराशर पुण्डरीकव्यासाम्बरीश बलिरुक्माङ्गलार्जुन विभीषण हनुमत्करुणशेष वाल्मीक्यादि परमभागवत संसूयमानस्य
क्षमात्र सञ्जरितसहस्राक्षादि विजय विभव विलासायाः
The domain of investigative psychology covers all aspects of psychology that are relevant to the conduct of criminal or civil investigations. Its focus is on the ways in which criminal activities may be examined and understood in order for the determination of the crime to be effective and legal proceedings to be appropriate. As such, investigative psychology is concerned with psychological inputs to the full range of issues that relate to the management, investigation and prosecution of crime. Detectives and others involved in these investigations become decision makers at each stage of the process and need to identify the possibilities for action on the basis of information they can obtain. This investigative decision making involves the identification and selection of options such as possible suspects or possible lines of inquiry that will lead to the eventual narrowing down of the search process, that is funnel system. In order to generate possibilities and select from them, detectives and other investigators must draw on some understanding of the actions of the offenders involved in the offence they are investigating. They must have some idea of typical ways in which offenders behave that will enable them to make sense of the information obtained. Throughout this process, they must amass the appropriate evidence to identify the perpetrator and prove their case in court. It follows that three processes are always present in any investigation that can be improved by psychological study. First, the collection and evaluation of information derived from the accounts of the crime. Once the suspects are elicited, there is further potential information about them, either directly from interviews with them or indirectly through reports from others. In addition, there may be information from various experts that has to be understood and may lead to actions. The major task of a police investigation is therefore typically to collect, assess and utilize a great variety of sources of information that provide accounts of crime. This is a task that can benefit considerably from the scientific study of human memory processes and other psychological studies of the reliability and validity of reports and their assessment. The second set of tasks is the making of decisions and related actions that will move towards the arrest and conviction of the perpetrator. From many studies of human decision making in other contexts, it is also apparent that there are likely to be many heuristic bias and other inefficiencies in the decision making process. Awareness of these can lead to effective ways of overcoming them. In order for decisions to be derived from the information available, inferences have to be made about the import of that information. The third set of tasks therefore derives from developing a basis for those inferences at the heart of police investigation. These inferences derive from an understanding of criminal behavior. For appropriate conclusions to be drawn from accounts available of the crime, It is necessary to have models of how various offenders act. These models allow the accounts of crime to be processed in order to generate possibilities for action. This process of model building testing is in effect a scientific psychological development of what is often referred to as offender profiling. In summary, investigative psychology can be summarized as the systematic scientific study of 1. Investigative information, its retrieval, evaluation and utilization. 2. Police actions and decisions, their improvement and support. 3. The inferences that can be made about criminal activity, its development, differentiation and prediction, with the objective of improving criminal and civil investigations. Heading: Information Retrieval. There are many psychological questions raised in relation to retrieval of information during a police investigation, and various studies have led to development of procedures to improve the information collected during an investigation. This includes the most valid and reliable way whereby it is possible to obtain information from either the crime scene, the victim, the witness or the offender that can ultimately form the basis of all analysis. Heading: Interviews. One of the most important aspects of the information obtained during an investigation is that it should have as much relevant detail as possible. Psychologists have therefore helped develop processes, especially for police interviews, that maximize the information obtained. In doing this, the perspective is taken that there are two issues that need to be as effective as possible. One is based on the assumption that the respondent in an interview is essentially trying to remember what occurred, therefore anything that can help the memory process should be of value. Second issue is the relationship between the interviewer and interviewee. If this relationship can be as supportive and helpful as possible, then more effective information is likely to be obtained. Out of these considerations, guidelines for interviews have been developed. The best known of these is referred to as the cognitive interview. This is based on the assumption that memory is an active reconstructive process rather than a relatively passive act of recall. It draws on the well-established finding that recognition of information is much easier than its recall. Therefore, any procedure that can help the interviewee to recreate the events in his or her own mind will be of value. This includes encouraging respondents to describe the events as they remember them rather than in strict response to particular questions in a given sequence. Reinstating the circumstances of the offense whenever possible by returning to the scene of exploring details like sounds and smells also accords with an understanding of the psychological processes by which memories are reconstructed. Attempts to consider the event from a variety of different perspectives are also considered of considerable value. A number of studies have shown that cognitive interview generates significantly more detailed information than conventional police interviews. Some studies show that information obtained is more accurate and also that more relevant information is obtained. But it is remarkably difficult to measure relevancy or accuracy precisely, so the full value of the cognitive interview is likely to vary considerably between situations and between interviewers. Witness recall. This is the heading. Attempts have also been made to use similar psychological processes to improve the recollection of faces and other details. Psychological research has also contributed considerably to the improvement in the validity of the traditional identity parade. Various procedures have been introduced by many police forces around the world to ensure that the recognition task set for the witness is appropriate and not open to bias. In particular, these take account of the need to protect the suspect against the possibility of the witness's memory being modified by experiences subsequent to the crime, such as meeting the suspect in other circumstances or seeing him in some media. Next, vulnerable interview is that's the heading. Number of witnesses may be regarded as vulnerable because of their age, emotional state, or intellectual ability. Such witnesses may be particularly open to suggestion or may be made especially anxious or confused by the interview process. Special interview procedures have therefore been developed for interviewing such people. The procedure pay particular attention to the relationship established between the interviewee and the interviewer and the need to phrase questions and facilitate answers in ways that make sense to the respondent. False confessions and allegations. Next heading. Psychologists have drawn attention to the possibility that some individuals may confess to crimes they have not committed. That is false positive. These false confessions may be a consequence of characteristics similar to those that make witnesses vulnerable, such as emotional state, intellectual ability, making the suspect more willing to accept suggestions from the interviewer. These may also be a product of cultural process rather than aspect of personality. In which, for example, groups from certain ethnic minorities may deem it essential to agree with whatever person in authority, such as a police officer, says to them. Investigative psychologists have also considered the ways in which false confessions may be produced in response to various forms of psychological or physical coercion. In many circumstances, investigators wish to assess the validity of information from witnesses because they consider that allegations may be false. If there are no objective criteria for doing this, they may use one of the number of validity assessment techniques. Most of these techniques are based on the assumption that honest accounts have identifiable characteristics that are different from a fabricated account. The most frequently used approach to statement validation is the statement validity assessment, which draws upon detailed analysis of the context or content of a statement, referred to as a criteria-based content analysis. This procedure has been widely used to evaluate allegations of abuse made by children. Authorship as the heading. A subset of validity questions relate to whether the words attributed to a particular author are actually the words of that person or not. This may occur, for example, when a suspect denies that he or she had made the statement attributed to him, or in other cases of forgery or fraud. To deal with these questioned utterances, there have been a variety of attempts to use techniques based on the quantitative examination of language. These approaches are sometimes put under the general heading of stylistics or forensic linguistics, or more generally, forensic psycholinguistics. These procedures are not to be confused with the graphology, which claims to be able to provide accounts of the personality of an author from the style of his or her handwriting. There is no consistent scientific evidence for these claims, though. Detecting deception as the heading. When the suspect is the source of information, additional factors are also important beyond those of memory retrieval. These often relate to the need to determine whether a person is attempting to deceive the interviewer. Thus, although there are many objective conventional police strategies for detecting deception, most obviously determining if the known facts contradict the suspect's claims, there are a number of situations in which some knowledge of behavioral and psycholinguistic cues to deception would be very helpful. A number of researchers have claimed that such cues are available, but others are more skeptical as to the possibility of any generally available indexes of deception from the actions or words of the suspect during a police interview. Another technique that has also been put forward to evaluate deception is the polygraph or a lie detector, which records changes in autonomous arousal system, that is emotional response. Such responses occur whenever a person perceives an emotionally significant stimulus. The most well-established indicator is that when the respondent is asked to consider information that only the perpetrator would be aware of, known as the guilty knowledge test. Scientific support for this technique is still being developed, and many jurisdictions do not allow the lie detector results to be presented as evidence in court, like India. Investigative decision making, that is heading. The main challenge for investigators is to make important decisions in often ambiguous and sometimes dangerous circumstances. The events surrounding the decisions are likely to carry a great emotional charge, and there may be other political and organizational stresses that also make objective judgments very difficult. A lot of information, much of which may be of unknown reliability, needs to be amassed and digested. The general literature in decision-making psychology shows that there are conditions that may lead to biases in thought processes and consequently decision-making. Recognition of the potential for these problems can lead to the development of procedures to reduce their likelihood. The challenges of police and other investigations may also be reduced by the development of decision support tools that reduce the complexity of information that needs to be understood and assist in the derivation of appropriate inferences from the material that is available to the police. The decision support tools that are emerging for use by police investigators all draw on particular perspectives on the nature of the problem. Visualization, that's the heading. Some support tools are based on the fact that human beings can often see patterns between associations and within activities if they can be presented in some form of visual summary. Bar charts of frequencies are one common example of this, but commercially available software will chart networks of contacts and the sequence of associations or actions. While these tools can be productive in summarizing a great deal of information and in association with databases, can improve the search for and access to crucial information that are very dependent on the skills of the particular user, often referred to in police forces as a crime analyst. In the wrong hands, these systems can imply a behavioral pattern through the strong visual impact that a diagram produced, when in fact the diagram is a biased emphasis of some peripheral aspect of the criminal behavior being investigated. Description, that is heading. A further level of support to decisions can be made by identifying the salient characteristics of the offences and offenders and by producing summary accounts of them. One widespread application of this use is the production of maps that indicate the locations where there are high frequency of crimes, sometimes called criminal hotspot. In these cases, the salient characteristics are simply where the crimes have occurred, and the description consists of some summary or averaging of the crimes over an area in order to indicate where its geographical focus might be. All description requires some selection, distillation, and averaging of information, and when that is done validly, the description is helpful. Analysis, next heading. A further level of assistance to police decision makers can be given by carrying out some form of analysis in the crime material, typically looking for patterns of co-occurrences or discriminating non-occurrences. An example of the former would be recognition that certain acts of vandalism occur shortly after the end of the school day near schools. Knowledge from the descriptive analysis of the age and background of offenders prosecuted for vandalism and the geographical hotspot information could be combined to target possible culprits and introduce other forms of crime detection. More advanced analysis of the co-occurrence of criminal behaviors could also be used for classifying offenders and generating different investigative strategies for the different forms of offenders. Inference, as heading. When clear relationships can be established between different aspects of crime that are of investigative interest, inferences can be made from one to the other. For example, an understanding of the relationship between where an offender offends and where he/she lives can be used to infer residential location from the knowledge of offense location. The use of inference for decision support activities is at the core of the area popularly known as offender profiling, which will be dealt with in more detail below. Appropriate inferences, that's the heading. The main psychological premise behind profiling is that there will be a consistency between the way offenders act at the crime scene and their characteristics. This is based on the broader literature based on longitudinal studies and crosses situational consistency in general as well as from findings on the development of criminal behavior. In many ways, behavioral profiling follows the same procedure as forensic science, which is another tool in police investigation with the same aim of analyzing the evidence at the crime scene. But rather than focusing on the biological and chemical components of the crime scene, profiling focuses on the behavioral element. In cases where forensic evidence has been compromised or where the offender has cleaned the crime scene so as not to leave a trace, behavioral evidence is much more difficult to remove from the crime scene, and traces of behavior will usually always be present, no matter what the offender does. For example, if you have an offender who removes from forensic evidence from the crime scene, that itself is a piece of behavioral evidence, because the mere fact that the offender is either not leaving forensic evidence, that is coming prepared to the crime scene, or removing it from the crime scene indicates something about the type of offender he or she is. This has often been referred to as A to C equation, where the aim is to link the action that occurred during the offence, including when and where it happens and to whom, to the characteristics of the offender, including offender's criminal history, background and relationship to the others. Three general interlinked areas have been the focus of recent research in offender profiling: individual differentiation, behavioral consistency, and inferences about offender characteristics. Individual differentiation as a heading. The first step in profiling is to devise a method for determining individual differentiation or for comparing individuals in terms of conceptual categories. This step in profiling is normally referred to as determining the actions A of the offender during the crime in question. The idea behind this process is that offenders engage in various ways of acting at the crime scene. These conceptual categories generally include subgroups of behavior with the same underlying psychological theme or significance for the offender. Individual differentiation aims to establish differences between the behavioral action of offenders in order to identify the type of crime that has been committed. The focus here is on analyzing the observable rather than motivational aspect of the crime to increase the reliability and practical utility of these models in actual investigation. Although it is important to gain insight into the cognitions of offenders and add these to emerging models, research has shown that motivations are inherently more subjective and difficult to measure. As such, behaviors provide a more reliable unit of analysis, at least at the first stages of building models of criminal differentiation that are valid, reliable, and ultimately useful and applicable to actual investigations. Another important issue is that variables on which they can draw are limited to those of use to police investigation. This implies that the A action variables are restricted to those known prior to any suspect being identified. The C or characteristic variables are limited to those on which the police can act on. So, the offender's personality characteristics, detailed measures of intelligence, attitude, and fantasies are all of less utility than the information about where the person might be living and his or her criminal history or domestic circumstances. Behavioral studies of differentiation usually focus on differences among crime scenes in various observable factors, including victim characteristics, interaction with the victim, nature of the offense, and other activities engaged in by the offender at the crime scene. Much of this work has aimed to understand how an offender engages in patterns of actions that all demonstrate a similar underlying psychological dimension. Any crime can be profiled using the appropriate frameworks, and the work to date has included theft, burglary, robbery, arson, fraud, rape, pedophilia, crimes committed by youth, homicide, serial homicide, and others. The relevant psychological dimensions depend on the crimes analyzed. Some examples used in homicide work include behaviors indicative of expressive and instrumental types of aggression, such as treating a victim as an object or a person, acting in a controlled or an impulsive manner, all of which are already well established thematic classifications of human behavior in the general psychological literature. Behavioral consistency, that's the heading. Behavioral consistency is critical to differentiating individuals and is the second key issue in empirical studies of offender profiling. Behavioral consistency comprises two separate yet interrelated fields of study. The first aims to look at the consistency across an individual's series of crimes, that is typically referred to as linking. The key research questions in the area of linking are whether crime scenes can be linked to each other and thereby an individual series can be identified, while also identifying how it differs from other series. Specifically, an important question is which behaviors are the most reliable to focus on when making this determination. Running through all these questions is the key question of what is meant by consistency and how this may be displayed. Behavioral consistency is a key issue in profiling, specifically for understanding both the development of an offender's criminal career and an individual's consistency across a series of crimes, that is, whether the same subsets of actions are displayed at each crime scene over a series linking serial crime. Much of this work has focused on whether consistency in criminal behavior can be established over time, as well as how individuals change and develop through learning and experience, and whether offenders specialize or are generalists. The search for consistencies has been approached in various ways in theoretical literature, notably by establishing whether the offender acts according to the same psychological subtype or a theme from one crime to the next, whether the offender engages in some specific behavior from one crime to next, modus operandi, or whether the offender engages in highly specialized behavior unique to them that are related more to their personal agenda or fantasies, that is signature. The first few published studies on empirically validating these theoretical concepts indicate that although some consistency is evident, our understanding of the intricacies of the actual patterns over time requires closer empirical study, specifically in terms of how offenders experiment, learn, develop, mature and change in a consistent manner across time, as well as how situational factors influence an offender's behavioral consistency. Experimentation heading. Apparent inconsistency may be observed throughout a series that may be explained by the offenders experimenting, trying out new behaviors from situation to situation. Although there appears to be inconsistency because the actions engaged in are visually different, the mere fact that experimentation occurs may be evidence of a certain type of offender and could thus be a mark for consistency. Next, learning heading. Most offenders will learn from their experiences. They will therefore be expected to alter their actions in the light of the consequences of the previous actions. An inferential implication of this is that it may be possible to link crimes to a common offender by understanding patterns and reasons of how behavior has changed from one offense to the next. Development heading. The unfolding psychological mechanisms that come with age provide a basis for change in cognitive and emotional processes. One reflection of this is an increase in expertise in doing a particular task. Evidence of such expertise is a crime can thus be used to help make inferences about stages in a criminal's development that he or she has reached, and indeed to indicate the way the crimes might change in the future. Maturation. This is essentially a biological process of change in a person's physiology with age. Knowledge of what is typical of people at a certain ages, such as sexual activity, can thus be used to form a view as to the maturity of the person committing the crimes and to the basis for longer term variations in an individual's criminal activity situation. One important reason for differences between a criminal's actions on two different occasions may be their reaction to the different circumstances faced. By understanding these circumstances and how the offender has responded to them, some inferences about their interpersonal style or situational responsiveness may be made and can be another marker for consistency and can have investigative implications. Inferences about offender characteristics. That's the heading. Inferences about offender characteristics is at the core of profiling and also uses consistency analysis as its main focus. At this stage, however, the main aim is to establish the link between the subtype of crime scene action engaged in and associated offender characteristics in order to make predictions about an offender based on their criminal action at the crime scene. This can then ultimately be used as a primary tool for the police to narrow their suspect pool down to statistically most likely offender. This is the C part of the action to characteristics, that is A to C equation. Offender characteristics focused on typically include demographics like gender, age and education, previous interpersonal and criminal history, home location and travel pattern known as geographical profiling, and the offender's relationship with the victim. Operational applications heading. All of the attempts to solve A to C equations are related to attempts to help answer the following operational questions. 1. Which suspects are most likely to have committed the crime in question? 2. Which crimes in a series are likely to have been committed by the same offender? 3. What are the salient characteristics of the offenders that will help investigators to identify and locate them? 4. Where geographically should searches for offenders be carried out? 5. What searches of police records or other sources of information should be carried out to help identify the offender? 6. What sense can be made of the offence that will help us organize our legal case? Investigative Psychology chapter and